Scary telling.
I hear my daughter cry, "Mommy, I'm so cold. Please let me in." I shut the curtains, knowing she won't cry much longer in the snow. It's been weeks since she's been gone, but I've learned to live without her. It was for her own good. You see, my daughter was born with a rare genetic condition that made her intolerant to the cold. Her body just couldn't handle it. I did everything I could to keep her warm, but it was never enough. One day, I made the difficult decision to let her go. I left her outside in the snow, hoping that the cold would take her quickly and painlessly. It was the only way to end her suffering. But now, as I hear her cries outside my window, I wonder if I made the right decision. Maybe I should have tried harder, found another way to save her. I try to push those thoughts aside, knowing that it's too late now. She's gone, and there's nothing I can do to change that. But then, something strange happens. I start to hear her voice in the house, calling out to me. At first, I think it's just my imagination, a side effect of the guilt that's been eating away at me. But the voice grows louder, more insistent. It's her, I know it is. She's found her way back to me. I follow the sound of her voice, and it leads me to the basement. The door creaks open, revealing a room that I haven't been in for years. The room where I used to keep all of her things. But now, the room is different. The walls are covered in ice, and there's a chill in the air that sends shivers down my spine. And there, in the corner, is my daughter. She's sitting on a pile of blankets, her body frozen solid. But she's alive. I can see her chest rising and falling with each breath. I rush over to her, wrapping her in a blanket and trying to warm her up. But it's no use. Her body is so cold that even my own warmth can't penetrate it. I know that she's going to die, and I'm the one who caused it. I sit there with her, holding her hand as her body grows colder and colder. Her breaths become more and more labored, until finally, she takes her last gasp of air and goes still. I'm filled with a sense of overwhelming guilt and regret. I should have never let her go. I should have found another way to help her. But then, something strange happens. Her body begins to change, becoming more and more transparent until it disappears completely. And in its place, I see a figure that I recognize all too well, the Grim Reaper himself. He looks at me with empty eye sockets, his voice echoing through the room. You chose her fate, and now you must pay the price. I try to run, but he's too fast. He catches me in his bony grasp, dragging me down into the depths of the underworld. I'm left alone in a cold, dark place, with no hope of escape. The only thing that keeps me company is the sound of my daughter's cries, calling out to me from beyond the veil of death. And now, I realize the true cost of my actions. I will spend eternity here, alone and cold, with nothing but my own guilt and regret to keep me company. I was excited to try out my new recipe for beef stew, simmering away on the stove for hours. My husband had gone out to run some errands, and I was looking forward to surprising him with a delicious home-cooked meal when he returned. As I sat down to eat, I took a spoonful of the hearty stew and savored the flavor. It was rich and flavorful, the perfect combination of beef, vegetables, and spices. I couldn't wait for my husband to try it. That's when I saw it, a glint of gold in the broth. At first, I thought it was a piece of vegetable or a stray bit of seasoning. But as I peered closer, my heart began to race. It was my husband's wedding ring. I recoiled in horror, nearly knocking over my bowl. How could this be? My husband never took off his ring, not even to shower. I immediately tried to call him, but his phone was off. Panic set in as I realized that something was terribly wrong. I rushed to the kitchen sink and emptied the pot, searching for any other clues. That's when I found it, a small vial of clear liquid tucked away in the back of the pantry. I didn't know what it was, but I had a terrible feeling that it was connected to the ring in my stew. I grabbed my coat and ran next door to my neighbor's house, begging for her help. She listened to my frantic story and agreed to come back to my house with me. Together, we searched every room, looking for any sign of my husband. That's when we found a bloody knife on the kitchen counter. My neighbor called the police, and they arrived quickly. As they investigated, I could feel my stomach churning with fear and uncertainty. Was my husband still alive? Had I unwittingly eaten a piece of him in my stew? Hours passed before the police found any concrete evidence. They discovered my husband's body in the garage, hidden under a tarp. He had been stabbed multiple times, and it appeared that someone had tried to dissolve his body in acid. As the reality of the situation sank in, I began to feel sick. I had been eating a stew that was cooked with my husband's wedding ring, a stew that may have been laced with poison. The thought made me want to vomit. The police never found out who had done this to my husband, and I was left with a deep sense of grief and anger. The stew that had once been so delicious and comforting now filled me with dread and horror. I threw out the rest of the pot and swore that I would never cook again. But even now, years later, the memory of that deadly stew still haunts me. I thought that killing my husband would solve all of my problems. He was abusive, controlling, and he made my life a living hell. So one night, I grabbed a kitchen knife and plunged it into his chest. I watched as the light faded from his eyes, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me. But that relief didn't last for long. The morning after I killed him, I woke up to the sound of his voice. "Good morning, honey," he said, as if nothing had happened. I froze, too terrified to move. How could he be alive? I went to the bedroom to check, and there he was, lying in bed as if he had never left. But something was different. His skin was pale and clammy, and his eyes were sunken and lifeless. He looked like a corpse. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that settled in my stomach and went about my day. But no matter where I went, I could feel his presence following me. He would whisper in my ear, telling me that he loved me and that he would never leave me. At first, I thought that I was losing my mind. Maybe the stress of killing him had finally caught up with me. But then, I started seeing things. His reflection in the mirror would smile at me, even when he wasn't there. I would hear his footsteps in the hallway, even when he was supposed to be at work. I knew that something was terribly wrong, but I didn't know what to do. How could I convince anyone that my dead husband was haunting me? Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. I tried to move on with my life, but it was impossible with his presence always looming over me. Every time I tried to start a new relationship, he would appear, scaring off anyone who dared to get close to me. I was trapped, living in a world where the dead refused to stay buried. And then, one day, I saw something that changed everything. I was walking down the street when I saw my husband, or at least, I thought it was him. He was standing on the other side of the road, watching me with his dead eyes. But then, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I followed him, not caring if I looked insane. I needed answers, and he was the only one who could give them to me. But as I followed him deeper into the city, I realized that something was off. The streets were empty, and the buildings were all boarded up. And then, I saw them. The other ghosts, wandering aimlessly through the deserted streets. Some of them were old, some of them were young, but all of them were dead. And all of them had someone they couldn't let go of. I realized then that I wasn't alone. I wasn't the only one haunted by the dead. And I knew that I had to find a way to break free from my husband's grasp. It wasn't easy, but I did it. I sought out a psychic, someone who could help me communicate with my dead husband. And through her, I was able to tell him that I didn't love him anymore, that I needed him to move on. And eventually, he did. He disappeared, leaving me alone in the silence. But even now, years later, I still hear his voice sometimes, whispering in my ear, telling me that he loves me. I don't know if he'll ever truly leave me alone, but I do know one thing. Death may have separated us, but it could never erase the memories of our undying love. It was a cold winter night when I heard the strange conversation between my 3-year-old daughter and someone I couldn't see. I was lying in my bed, trying to fall asleep, but their voices were too loud to ignore. I couldn't make out what they were saying at first, but as I listened more closely, my blood ran cold. "But Mommy, I don't want to," my daughter's voice pleaded. "All little girls stab their daddies," a voice that sounded like mine replied. I sat upright in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. It couldn't be me, I thought. I would never say something like that to my own child. My husband was out of town on a business trip, so it couldn't be him either. Who was talking to my daughter? I got out of bed and tiptoed to my daughter's bedroom. The door was slightly open, and I could see the shadow of a figure sitting on her bed. As I got closer, I could see that it was a small girl with long black hair, dressed in a white nightgown. But when I tried to turn on the light, she disappeared into thin air. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was hallucinating. But when I opened them again, I saw that the small girl was back, sitting on my daughter's bed, her eyes fixed on me. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Who are you?" I whispered. "I'm Daddy's little helper," she said with a sinister smile. I tried to scream, but no sound came out of my mouth. I was frozen with fear. The little girl then held out a small knife and handed it to my daughter. "Here, take this," she said. "You know what to do." My daughter took the knife and held it in her tiny hand, her eyes wide with terror. I could see the fear in her eyes, and I knew that I had to act fast. I grabbed my daughter and ran out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. I could hear the little girl's laughter echoing through the hallway as I hurried down the stairs. I called the police and told them everything that had happened. When they arrived, they searched the house but found no trace of the little girl. They thought I was crazy, but I knew what I had seen. After that night, strange things began to happen in our house. I would hear strange whispers in the middle of the night, and objects would move on their own. My daughter would wake up screaming, saying that the little girl was back. I knew that we had to leave that house, so we moved to a new city and started over. But I could never forget the terror of that night. And every time my daughter looked at me, I couldn't help but wonder if she would ever forget the little girl who tried to make her stab her own father. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the sink in front of me. My husband, Jack, was on his knees, his arms swallowed nearly to the elbow by the drain. He had been trying to retrieve my wedding ring, which had fallen down there earlier that day. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as I watched his face light up with excitement. "I think I feel your ring," he exclaimed, his voice muffled by the pipes. I smiled at him, glad that he had managed to retrieve it. But as I reached for the switch to turn off the garbage disposal, something inside me snapped. My hand hovered over the switch for a moment, and I felt a sudden urge to flip it on. "Oh, that's great, love," I said, my voice calm and steady. "And I know about Vanessa." Jack's face contorted in confusion, and I could see the panic in his eyes as he tried to pull his arm out of the drain. But it was too late. With a flick of my wrist, the garbage disposal whirred to life, its blades tearing into Jack's flesh. Blood and bits of bone flew out of the drain, splattering against the walls and floor. I watched in horror as Jack's body thrashed and convulsed, his screams of agony drowned out by the sound of the disposal. But as the carnage subsided and the disposal ground to a halt, I felt a strange sense of calm. I had done what needed to be done. I had rid myself of the man who had been cheating on me with Vanessa, my best friend. I cleaned up the mess as best I could, wiping down the walls and floor with bleach and stuffing what was left of Jack's body into a trash bag. I left it out on the curb for the garbage truck to collect the next morning. Over the next few weeks, I went about my life as if nothing had happened. I put on a brave face for our 3-year-old daughter, Emma, and even managed to attend Jack's funeral without shedding a tear. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, I began to notice something strange. Every time I turned on the garbage disposal, I could hear Jack's voice calling out to me from the pipes. At first, I thought I was imagining things. But the voice grew louder and more insistent until I could no longer ignore it. I could hear Jack's screams of pain and the sound of the blades tearing into his flesh over and over again. I tried to ignore it, but it was no use. The voice haunted me day and night until I could no longer bear it. One day, I snapped. I grabbed a kitchen knife and plunged it into the drain, hoping to silence the voice once and for all. But as I pulled the knife back out, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Attached to the blade was a scrap of flesh, still warm and sticky with blood. And etched into the flesh, in Jack's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "I'm not dead yet, Sarah." I dropped the knife and stumbled back, my mind reeling with terror. I realized then that I had made a terrible mistake. Jack was not gone, not really. He was still here, with me, in the pipes. And he was angry.